The sun over Harlan County, Kentucky, doesn't rise so much as it bleeds, slow and red through the ridgelines, like something wounded trying to hold itself together. That's the way Leonard Pruitt always described it to people who'd never been there. He'd seen sunrises in 3 countries and 2 war zones, and he still thought the ones over Black Bear Mountain were the hardest to look at, not because they were ugly, because they were too honest. He was 64 years old when he drove back into Harlan County for the first time in 11 years. The truck was a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a rear bumper held on by 2 bolts and a prayer. In the passenger seat, a 6-year-old Belgian Malinois named Kodak sat with his nose pressed to the gap in the window, reading the air the way Leonard used to read terrain, carefully, constantly, without looking like he was doing it at all. Leonard had named him Kodak because the dog remembered everything, places, people, the particular way a room smelled 3 years after you'd left it. He was the kind of dog that didn't let you forget things either, which was both his greatest quality and, depending on the day, his most exhausting one. The truck climbed the 2-lane road that wound up past the old Pentecostal church, still white, still missing the same shutter on the second window from the left, and Leonard didn't look at it. He looked at the road. He'd learned a long time ago that looking at things that hurt you didn't make them hurt less. It just made the hurt more detailed. He had $214 in his checking account. He had a cardboard box in the truck bed with clothes, a shaving kit, a coffee mug from the VA in Lexington, and a photograph of his daughter taken at her high school graduation 16 years ago. He had Kodak. He had the deed to a property he hadn't set foot on in over a decade, 3 acres and a farmhouse outside of town that had belonged to his father, and before that, to his grandfather, and before that to a man named Thaddeus Pruitt, who'd cleared the land by hand sometime around 1902. He had nothing else. The eviction notice had come on a Tuesday. He'd been living in a rented house in Corbin for 2 years, working at a lumber yard, doing well enough. Doing well enough had always been the ceiling for Leonard. Not thriving, not struggling, just well enough. And then the lumber yard had closed. Not slowly, not with warning, just a notice on the door one Monday morning, and a phone call from the owner who apologized and meant it, and said there was nothing he could do. 3 months later, after the savings ran down and the security deposit disappeared into a landlord dispute, Leonard couldn't afford to fight. Well enough became nothing at all. His daughter, Sheila, had offered to let him stay. She lived in Nashville now, married to a man named Warren, who worked in insurance and coached youth soccer on weekends, and had never in his life needed anything from anyone. Leonard liked Warren fine. He just couldn't be the kind of man who slept in his son-in-law's guest room. He wasn't sure that was a virtue. He suspected it might be a flaw, but it was his flaw. And at 64, you stop trying to fix the ones that are built into the frame. So he'd called the county assessor's office and confirmed the taxes on the Pruitt land were paid. Just barely, through a small automatic account his father had set up years ago. And he'd pointed the truck south on I-75 and driven until the mountains came back and the air smelled like pine and wood smoke and creek water, and something in his chest unknotted by about 10%. The farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel drive that had mostly gone back to grass down the center. Leonard pulled in slow, cut the engine, and sat for a moment. Kodak put his head on Leonard's thigh without being asked. The house was still standing. That was more than he'd hoped for. The porch boards were soft in 2 spots near the steps. The front door had swollen in its frame and needed his shoulder to open. Inside, the air was cold and close and smelled like old newspapers and something sweet underneath. His grandmother's molasses cookies, he thought, or maybe just the memory of them lodged somewhere in the walls. The kitchen ceiling had a water stain shaped like a hand. The wood stove in the living room was covered in dust but intact. The windows were all present and unbroken, which felt like the most significant mercy of the morning. Leonard stood in the middle of the living room for a long time. Kodak moved through the house methodically, nose down, cataloging. He disappeared into the back hallway and came back and sat in front of Leonard and looked at him. "I know," Leonard said. "It's not much." Kodak wagged once and went back to investigating. The first week was hard in the practical way that survival is hard. Cold nights, no functioning heat, until Leonard got the wood stove cleaned out and operational. Meals that were more about caloric efficiency than enjoyment. He drove into town for supplies twice. Both times, people looked at him with that particular expression. That means, "I know who you are, and I'm waiting to see if you remember who I am." He remembered. Harlan County was not a place that let you forget people. On the second trip, at the hardware store on Cumberland Avenue, a man named Doyle Speck came up behind him in the plumbing aisle and said, "Leonard Pruitt, you come back." Doyle was 3 years older than Leonard, had the kind of face that looked like it had been through weather, and had worked at the county assessor's office for as long as Leonard could remember. They'd gone to the same high school. They weren't friends exactly, but they were the kind of people who knew each other at a depth that friendship doesn't always reach. "Just came back to sort out the property," Leonard said. Doyle nodded. He bought a bag of concrete mix and didn't ask anything else, which was its own kind of courtesy. But at the register, the woman behind the counter, a young woman, couldn't have been more than 25, with a name tag that said Brianna, asked if he was going to be staying at the Pruitt place. Leonard said yes. She nodded and didn't say anything, but something shifted slightly in her expression. Something careful. He noticed it. He filed it away. The trouble came on a Thursday evening, 10 days after he arrived. He'd been out back splitting wood. There was a stand of deadfall along the eastern edge of the property that would keep him in fuel through the winter if he worked at it. And Kodak had been ranging the property line the way he did, easy and watchful. When Leonard looked up, the dog was standing at the edge of the tree line about 40 yards out, still as a fence post, staring at something Leonard couldn't see. "Kodak, come." The dog didn't move. Leonard set down the maul and walked over. Kodak stood at the mouth of what looked like an old deer trail, threading into the brush. Not unusual. The property had been untended for years, and deer trails were everywhere. But the dog wasn't tracking a deer. He was tracking something that had been there recently. His posture was different. Less hunt, more attention. "There's nothing down there, boy." Kodak looked back at him, then down the trail, then back at him again. Leonard knew that look. He'd learned a long time ago that when Kodak looked at him that way, not urgent, not alarmed, just certain, the correct response was to pay attention. "All right," Leonard said. "Show me." The trail descended maybe 100 yards into the tree line before it opened into a small clearing he didn't recognize until he was standing in the middle of it and the geometry clicked. His grandfather had kept a cold storage pit out here, dug into the hillside, reinforced with timber, used before the house had reliable refrigeration. Leonard had been maybe 8 or 9 the last time he'd been out here. His grandfather had shown it to him as a piece of family history, the way old men show children things they want to outlast themselves. The entrance had been covered over with boards, and then, over the years, with leaf fall and sediment. Kodak was standing on top of it, pressing his nose between the boards, tail moving slowly. Leonard knelt and looked closer. The boards were newer than they should have been. Not new, weathered, and crusted with dirt on top. But the wood itself was not 60-year-old timber. Someone had been here, had replaced the original covering with something more deliberate. He got his fingers under the edge of one board and pulled. It was lighter than he expected. Whoever had laid these boards hadn't anchored them. They came up in a single section, hinged together with a cross brace, like a door that had been designed to look like it wasn't. Beneath it, a shallow space, maybe 4 feet deep, timber-framed walls still solid, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a length of cord, a rectangular bundle about the size of a large book. Leonard climbed down. The cold came up around him. Kodak lay at the edge above, watching. He picked up the bundle and turned it in his hands. The oilcloth was stiff but uncracked, which meant it hadn't been there long. Relatively. Years maybe, but not decades. He untied the cord carefully. Inside the oilcloth was a manila envelope, sealed, and on the front of it written in his father's handwriting, cramped and slanted, always leaning like it was walking into wind, his own name. Leonard. Just that. Just his name. He stood in that cold pit with the dirt walls and the smell of old wood, and stood very still for a moment. His father, Thomas Pruitt, had died 7 years ago. Leonard had not made it back for the funeral. He'd been in the middle of something. A job, a situation, a version of his life he no longer lived. And by the time he'd arranged what he thought he needed to arrange, his sister had called and said it was over, and there was nothing left to come back for. He'd carried that with him. Not loudly, not in a way he talked about, but he'd carried it. He tucked the envelope inside his jacket and climbed back out. He waited until he was inside, at the kitchen table, with the wood stove going and Kodak settled on the floor with his chin on his paws before he opened it. There were 3 items inside. The first was a letter, 2 pages, handwritten. He set it aside and looked at the other 2 first, the way you do when you're not sure you're ready for the thing you most need to read. The second was a photocopy of a legal document, a property agreement, dated 18 years ago. Leonard read through it slowly. The language was dense, but the meaning became clear. His father had entered into a development agreement with a man named Caldwell Briggs, who had represented himself as a licensed land developer from Lexington. The agreement gave Briggs the right to survey and option 60% of the Pruitt property, specifically the rear acreage along the creek, the most valuable part, in exchange for a payment of $40,000 and a promise of future proceeds from any sale. His father had signed it. The $40,000 had been paid. Leonard could see the bank receipt included in the stack of papers inside the envelope. But there was also a second document, dated 8 months after the first. A letter from the Kentucky Secretary of State's office, informing Thomas Pruitt that Caldwell Briggs and Associates was not a registered entity in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, had never been licensed as a developer, and was currently the subject of a civil fraud investigation involving 4 other landowners in the region. His father had been defrauded, $40,000 taken, and the option agreement, which had never been properly executed under Kentucky law because Briggs wasn't licensed, had been recorded anyway, incorrectly, fraudulently, but recorded, which meant there was a lien-like cloud on the rear portion of the property that Leonard now owned, tied to a company that didn't exist, signed by a man who had taken the money and vanished. The third item was a business card. On the back, in his father's handwriting, "Do not sell to anyone without talking to Doyle first. Doyle knows." Leonard sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up the letter and read it. His father had not been an expressive man. Not in person, not on paper. The letter was short and blunt, in the way that Thomas Pruitt had always been short and blunt about the things that mattered to him. He had found out about the fraud late. Too late, he wrote, to do anything about it himself. His health was already failing by the time he understood the full picture. He had consulted with Doyle Speck, who had worked in the county assessor's office and understood the legal landscape well enough to know what options existed. Those options were limited. The fraudulent recording could be challenged, but it would require a lawyer and documentation, and someone willing to do the work. Thomas Pruitt had been dying. He hadn't had the energy or the money, but he had left the documentation. He had found what he could: the original agreement, the Secretary of State letter, correspondence from 2 of the other defrauded landowners who had already filed in court, and he had bundled it all together and put it in the place he trusted most. The place he'd shown Leonard when Leonard was 8 years old. The family place. The one that had been here before all of them and would be here after. "I don't know if you'll come back," the letter said. "I don't know if any of this matters to you now. You've been gone a long time and I understand why, even if I didn't always say so. But this land belongs to the Pruitts. It's always belonged to us. I'd hate to see it taken from you too, first by that man, and then by my not telling you. So I'm telling you, The dog will find it, the letter ended. That's a joke, son. I hope you still have a dog. He sat there for a while after he finished reading. Kodak got up, walked to him, and put his head on Leonard's knee. He left me a note, Leonard said. Your predecessor would have been the one to find it. He just hoped I'd have a dog. Kodak pressed in closer. Leonard scratched behind his ears and didn't say anything else. He went to see Doyle the next morning. He called first, which felt overly formal but also right. Doyle answered on the second ring and said to come by the house, not the office. Doyle's house was 3 miles out from town, a neat brick ranch with a vegetable garden along the south side that had been put to bed for winter. His wife, a small woman named Arlene, brought coffee and then left them at the kitchen table in the particular way that people leave other people alone when they understand them being discussed is between the two of them. Your daddy showed me those papers about 4 years before he died, Doyle said. I told him what I'm going to tell you. Briggs was a grifter. He worked a circuit through eastern Kentucky, found old family properties with no clear succession plans, came in with money and fast talk, tied up the back acreage with an agreement that looked legal but wasn't. By the time people understood what happened, he was already in the next county. Where is he now? Last I heard, he was in Knoxville. There's a civil judgment against him from a case down in Bell County. Landowner named Tatum Holloway fought it all the way through and won. But by then Briggs had reorganized the company under a different name. Doyle wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. The recording on your property can be challenged. With the documentation your daddy left, you've got a stronger case than Holloway did, because you've got the Secretary of State letter and the fraud complaint. But you'll need a lawyer. I don't have money for a lawyer, I know, but there's a clinic at the University of Kentucky Law School that handles property fraud cases in rural counties. They took on 2 of the other Briggs cases. I've got a name there. He slid a piece of paper across the table. I've been holding on to that for 7 years, waiting for you to come back. Leonard looked at the paper. He looked at Doyle. Why didn't you reach out? Wasn't my place, Doyle said simply. This is your family's business. Your daddy asked me to hold the information until you came back to get it. He believed you'd come back. I almost didn't. I know, but almost doesn't count in property law. The next part was not quick. That part of the story, the legal clinic, the filed complaint, the process of untangling an 18-year-old fraudulent recording from a property deed, took the better part of 4 months. Leonard stayed in the farmhouse through the winter. He split wood and repaired the porch boards and re-caulked the kitchen windows and, slowly, the house began to hold heat the way it was meant to. The attorney who took the case was a third-year law student named Priya, who worked under a supervising professor named Dr. Aldrich, and between the two of them, they were more relentless about the documentation than Leonard had expected. He provided everything from the envelope. They found court records from the Bell County case and cross-referenced them. They filed in Harlan County Circuit Court in January. Caldwell Briggs, it turned out, was still in Knoxville. He was 61 years old, operated a property consulting business under the name Bluegrass Land Partners, and had done this particular thing, or variations of it, to at least 11 rural Kentucky families over 20 years. He had a talent for finding land that had been in families for generations, land whose owners were old and tired and didn't have lawyers on retainer. He had a talent for making $40,000 feel like a lot of money at the right moment. He had a talent for signing agreements that looked legal until someone looked closely. He did not, as it turned out, have a talent for dealing with third-year law students with access to case databases and a supervising professor who had been furious about this particular category of fraud for 15 years. The hearing was on a Wednesday in March. Leonard drove down in the truck with Kodak in the passenger seat. He wore the jacket he'd bought in December, his second nicest thing after the truck itself. And he sat in the third row of the courtroom gallery, while Priya stood at the plaintiff's table and walked the judge through 18 years of documentation in a voice that was calm and precise and left no gaps. Briggs was there with an attorney who seemed underprepared and uncomfortable. The judge, a woman named Calloway, who looked like she had seen every variation of this situation and was tired of all of them, asked Briggs's attorney twice to clarify how his client had been licensed to execute the original agreement. The attorney could not clarify this because there was no clarification available. Caldwell Briggs had not been licensed, had never been licensed. The agreement was void. Judge Calloway removed the fraudulent recording from the property record. She also referred the matter to the county attorney for potential criminal proceedings. Briggs left the courtroom without looking at Leonard. Leonard watched him go and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was mostly tired, not satisfied, not vindicated, just tired and quietly glad and ready to go home. He called Sheila from the parking lot. She cried, which surprised him. He hadn't told her the details because he hadn't wanted her to worry or Warren to offer money or anything to become complicated. He'd just told her he was sorting out the property. She'd believed him and called every 2 weeks and not pushed. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you tell me? Didn't know how it was going to go. You should have told me anyway." "I know. Are you okay?" He leaned against the truck. Kodak had his nose through the gap in the window, reading the parking lot air. The March sky over Harlan County was that pale early spring gray that somehow felt more optimistic than a blue sky, like something getting ready. "I'm okay," Leonard said. "I'm good, actually. Is the house livable?" "Getting there. Can I come see it?" He thought about the porch boards he'd replaced, the kitchen ceiling he hadn't gotten to yet, the bedroom that still smelled like closed time. He thought about the clearing in the woods, the old cold storage pit, the oilcloth bundle, his father's cramped handwriting leaning into the wind. "Yeah," he said, "come see it." Doyle came by the property on a Saturday in April, unannounced the way he'd probably been stopping by places for 60 years. He brought 2 sandwiches from a diner in town and a thermos of coffee and didn't say much while they sat on the repaired porch and looked out at the field. Kodak lay between them with his chin on the porch boards, blinking at the afternoon. "Your daddy would have liked knowing how it turned out," Doyle said eventually. He knew how it was going to turn out. That's why he left the papers. Doyle considered that. He had faith in the law. He had faith that I'd come back, Leonard said. "That's different." Doyle was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You going to stay?" Leonard looked at the field, at the fence line that needed work along the north side, at the tree line where the deer trail disappeared into the woods, at the particular way the afternoon light came off Black Bear Mountain, when the sun was getting low, and the ridge lines went gold, and the shadows went long, and the whole county seemed to exhale. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to stay." Kodak's tail moved once against the porch boards without the dog lifting his head, slow, deliberate, like he'd known the whole time, and was only now allowing himself to say so. The mountains held still in the distance, the light kept going, and Leonard Pruitt, 64 years old, sat on his grandfather's porch on his family's land, clear and unencumbered, and finally, after a very long time, exactly where he was supposed to be.